Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our discussion here today. It is a huge pleasure to introduce to you Sharif Azami, and he's speaking to us today about navigating differences in an age of toxic polarization with reference to the United States. And for us at the Center for Governance and Markets, this is a very important issue because we care so much about bridging divides that in our world today, everybody has opinions, but very rarely do people listen to people or engage with those with whom they disagree. And so one of the reasons we set up this center was to be very intentional in creating space for difference. And I hope that's evident to all of you in everything that we do. So when I met Sharif and learned about his work, and I'll talk to you a little bit about his background, it was like the perfect person came into our world to talk about polarization. And he's lived in the United States for about the past 15 years and has spent many years working in the bridging space, in the philanthropic community, the nonprofit world here in the United States. And he's been an early architect of bridge building and strengthening democracy ecosystems here. And so today he's going to share with us his insights on what lies ahead as we work to build a just, multicultural, and multiracial democracy. And he's going to talk about toxic polarization and extremism, and how these two elements are not just undermining key democratic institutions and norms here at home, but the way that these elements interplay to threaten global governance and shared flourishing. But what's so fascinating about Sharif's background is that he comes from Kandahar, Afghanistan. And as I tell many of our scholars who have come to our center from outside the United States, that the lens that outsiders have on what's happening here are the clearest. They are the freshest lenses. And those from the outside can help us see things that we ourselves cannot see, that we struggle to see. So he works within the philanthropic sector to mend America's deepest divides and strengthen democracy. His work seeks to develop new pathways for a just and multiracial democracy here in the US. He's worked on governance, social transformation, and peace building since the early 2000s with a host of international organizations, including Oxfam, United Nations, and others. He's earned a master's in international development from Duke University and has a graduate certificate in peace and conflict resolution from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So with these lenses, he's going to talk to us about the dynamics of polarization here in the United States. And so without further ado, Sharif, I've just met you today, but I feel like I've known you my whole life. So thank you so much for coming all the way from Washington in the snow to be with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jen. Well, I would be remiss to not thank Jen for this opportunity. I'm also particularly thankful to Jen, the center, and the university for something very special, which is the Afghan project. That's another part of me. I care deeply about that world. As someone who got stuck in Afghanistan last year myself, I know how that feels. It's a very hard thing. And so to see some of these Afghan scholars here is just a delight. And I have this picture on purpose here. This is Professor John Powell. If you want to understand othering and belonging, you have to be familiar with his work. He's at the Berkeley Center. He has a center on othering and belonging. And so I think I purposefully put it here because I think he is one of my guides and North Stars and really mentors in trying to understand this work and to navigate it. But before I get started, I mean, we just had the midterm elections. What do y'all think? I'm curious. I mean, maybe I'm right in the center and far from, some of the local settings. What were the reactions? Pennsylvania was one of the very interesting states. A lot of people were thanking you and sharing different thoughts, but I'm curious, like, how did it play out here? Any observations? Any thoughts? It was all great. What is
I think many people were surprised. Predictions were different. we walked great was expected, but it didn't happen. It's a big blow to those who are called quote unquote, what state election deniers.
Yeah.
And they lost. And it's a big win for President Biden. And it's unprecedented in the last 70 years or so, since 1946, that midterms were every time the opposing party was winning. And it's, based on the data presented, it's really unprecedented.
Yeah.
Many people say President Biden resembles FDR in that sense, I suppose. But even during FDR, such kind of win was not happening. I think those who, it's polarized, as you say.
Yeah. So if you look at it, a couple of things I want to, it's very interesting about the US. It's just the two coasts, and the rest of the country. This is a very interesting piece. But then also look at the urban-rural, right? How, even in Pennsylvania, I think it's across the state, what you see is this different forms of divides. But one of them is, which is very explicit, is also the urban and rural divide. Another observation that I would share, usually in thriving democracies, when you have elections, there's this like positive energy. This candidate is going to do this incredible thing. That candidate is going to do this incredible thing. And there is this virtuous competition, right? And you're trying to figure out who's doing the best thing and then go for that candidate. Like that's how it should be ideally. In the US, yes, please.
Well, I just want to say that like you're mentioning it, and I'm thinking about the election that we just had with the Senate candidate. And to echo what I hear, I listen to the local talk radio all the time. And I want to understand how people in this region feel. And I get the sense that there was a huge disappointment among both candidates that we didn't get a virtuous cycle. Is that there was disappointment in both candidates. I know that some of them have huge fans here, but in general, there was like disappointment that, Oz wasn't really from Pennsylvania. He was, and then Fetterman, had his health issues and wasn't, I think people expected him to be, and maybe he should have withdrawn. And I think there was a sense of kind of disillusionment with both of them. That many people had. I think in the middle, right?
Yeah, but I think more generally, that's true. But I think more generally, when we were sitting and looking at these elections, I think one of the biggest issue for us was how do we make sure there are hotspots of violence? A lot of people are relieved that we had just violent-free elections. And it's just like to think about it in that way in the US today. It's just like, like a very interesting idea that you're not thinking about it in the sense of, who's the best next candidate who's going to do this incredible things, but you're thinking about how do we pass these elections so that there are no violence, and how do we make sure that there are no hotspots. Really, for a lot of people, this was a big concern that there would be again such an issue. Now, I wanted to bring you to this issue. How bad are things, right? In terms of democracy in the United States and how things. Last year, there was historians that spoke to Biden, and then they came out publicly and said things were not really good, and they had to speak even publicly. And there was this survey done recently by Access Hypothesis that asked people, what do you think about these issues? Just to think about what the state of democracy is in the US. Some of the questions, if you look at it, how much support there is for it, right? Like strong unelected leaders are better than elected ones. Can you see like how much support? This is pretty significant, overthrowing judges. Especially on the second question, like, do you see how many Democrats are saying like, yes, you should be able to overthrow judges if you don't agree with their decisions. And so it's not partisan, let's just say in that sense. More broadly, there was a study done which basically concluded that elites in the US today are more polarized than they were during the Civil War. Okay. Not just that, one of my favorite authors, Asma, she does great work between religious freedom and just other rights. And she notes that today we have these in-groups and out-groups, right? And it's actually everywhere, from the smaller organizations to macro levels. And if you don't pursue them as part of your in-group, they're the enemy, right? You simply act out against them simply because they're the out-group, if there is no other reason. Right? So that's where we are. And so it's like sorting. I think more broadly, you can be okay with someone on any other kind of grounds of diversity, but ideological diversity, right? So you would ask, why is that? And this is a complicated chart, but I want to explain, okay? I looked at this issue very carefully, like why is this happening in the US? There are so many drivers of this. And these are sort of our time. It's not happening just today, right? This is happening for a very long period of time. Just to zoom in on three, I mean, I'm just ignoring the global geopolitical issues. I'm ignoring the environmental challenges, right? The three that I really have zoomed in on, like this issue of othering and misperception, it actually comes from isolation. A lot of people are incredibly isolated today. And the COVID pandemic, the whole digital world is actually making it worse. In addition to that, if you think about this economic marginalization, right? Once I was asking someone, I said, what do you think about the middle class? A colleague of mine, and she said, what middle class? Technically in the US, it barely exists anymore. The middle class that was like really the strength of this country it's almost disappearing. I mean, unless you're in the top 10% of this country, you're barely surviving. Right? So that the gap, the disparity has really increased. And then you've had a lot of structural barriers to flourishing, so this issue of hierarchy of human value, what you could put all the race issues in it, but the broader term we would use is hierarchy of human value. So over time, you put that into the system of what we call democracy. In the inside, what you see is this distrust, dysfunction, and division. What is more interesting is this thing, right? So this system was built on the premise that it should be able to mediate differences and resolve them, and out of it bring some kind of policy outcomes. Now that system is broken. In the last at least 3, 4, 5 election cycles, what you see is each time each party is in, their biggest priority is how to undo what the other party did, right? That's how our politics operate. In addition to that, what it does is it creates this sort of, that's what we call toxic polarization. It creates this negative feedback loop. Today, outside, if you go, no matter where you are, and if you're trying to bring people together, if you're trying to bring something that has to do with unity, it's almost impossible to do, right? But if you're divided, if you're divisive, you almost have nothing to do. You'll be successful. That's what we call the dangerous toxic feedback loop. So on one hand, this whole thing was set up to mediate differences, and based on that, achieve outcomes that hopefully would be acceptable to most people. That's not happening. Each party, when they come, their biggest priority is how do you undo what the other party did, right? And like this, how sustainable do you think this? How many more cycles do you think you have when you have all these growing social pathologies, when you have all these growing economic challenges, you have, environmental challenges, all these different challenges. So on one hand, you're not able to offer any solutions, policy solutions to that. In addition to that, then you have this thing where if you're breaking, you're going to be very successful, but if you're trying to be building, it's almost impossible to do. So that's what we have. Now, I wanted to add to that. There is something else that is making matters worse. And one of them is this issue of majority minority. So the US, there is the census that the US is going to be a majority minority country by 2045. That's what the projections are. Would love for you to watch this talk by Samarani. She's one of my best friends. She has a great talk on what this means for the US, majority minority. It's already happening in many states, in many cities. The majority are actually minorities. It means the white folks are not the majority in those contexts. And based on my experience, Ibu Patel, he runs this organization called Interfaith America. And it's like, just because you brought the ingredients to a kitchen table does not necessarily mean that the meal is going to be served. In other words, diversity in itself is a perfect recipe for tribalism if you don't build the mechanisms to engage it, right? And so that is happening, right? So from my experience, like before, diversity in the US was sort of a cherry on the top. It didn't have consequences for power sharing. I actually hypothesize that the more you go to the majority minority, the more consequences it's going to have for power, right? And so as a result, even drawing on my experience in Afghanistan, right, the last 20 years, what I saw in front of my eyes was, as we were trying to build an inclusive nation, the Taliban worked very systematically on two forms of identities. One was Islamic nationalism, and then with it, Pashtun nationalism. And the more they were successful in making that a thick identity, the weaker, especially the other questions of Afghanistan, the weaker we became. And once they made that a thick identity, we stood no chance, okay, of winning. The same thing, this is what I see here in the US. These two forms of identities, so this fusion of Christian nationalism and white nationalism, the more you get to that majority minority, the thicker identity that will become. And the more thicker it becomes, the more tribalism you'll see in this country, right? So this is just something I saw happen in a very different context. And now I see this majority minority, and like, unless you engage that diversity. So we did a study about 3-4 months ago in the US, despite the increased diversity, and this was a study with PRI, Public Religion Research Institute, despite the increased diversity in the US, 90% of white folks do not have a person of color in their core friendship network. That's 90, right? So what does it mean, right? Like, you are actually getting more and more. So this has consequences unless we figure out how to engage diversity in America. And that in itself can be a perfect recipe for tribalism. So this doesn't help the matters. Now, how does this play out? I mean, when I am out there and you're trying to have some work and you're trying to bridge divides, build something more constructive. If you're naive like me, right? Like, I usually think about impact, like, how am I changing the world, right? Like, this is how I think about the world. So in this work, what I was trying to do was figure out, what does belonging mean? Like, how can everybody belong in this country? If I'm asking, how is race statistically not a factor in education or income outcomes in, let's say, 10 years from today? If I'm asking, how could increase civic friendships? If I'm looking at 90% of white folks not having a friendship, a friend, that's of color, like, how do I do that? This issue really has a potential to cripple you. You know why? Like, let me ask you this question. What's the difference between shared flourishing and shared prosperity? Can you tell me? What's the difference? Curious. Anybody?
This is a trick question.
No. So if you're like me, naive enough, and go out there in elite circles in DC, and you submit a paper and want some people to take you seriously, depending on which term you use, you would be either automatically canceled or you will be accepted. People will make up their mind about you and your politics and who you are based on what term you use. So if you're going to conservative circles, I think they will respond to you if you wrote shared prosperity. If you're going to liberal circles, I think they will respond to you if you wrote shared flourishing. The same way, this deep cancel culture is like so ingrained, right? So when I go to conservative liberal circles, first of all, if you're very good, you should be talking about radical. You should be talking about bold and revolutionary, right? You're really pure, okay? Then there comes the second category, where you have this openness to interfaith, right? Like it's still cool, like even though it's now becoming a little bit conservative in some liberal circles, but interfaith is good. They might have a bit more problem with multi-faith or interreligious, if you use that term, okay? So very interesting. Then there's this whole thing which caught me off guard because I had the hardest time to bring conservative individuals to bridge building. But within some liberal circles, they're like, oh, maybe we could welcome pluralism. Bridge building is conservative. So I'm like, I have the hardest time to bring conservative folks to bridge building work, and you're telling me it's conservative, right? And then there is this whole thing about breaking, dismantling versus building. There's this whole sort of debate within liberal circles whether we should be building or we should be dismantling. It's a whole nother thing. In conservative circles, right? Civic education organizing, if you mention these words, you're canceled. Because these two terms were, really appropriated by progressives as their thing. So now all conservatives are really skeptical. The minute you say civic engagement or organizing, especially cultural organizing, there's no way. If you're patriotic, if you like the flag, right? If you like religious freedom, religious liberty. I mean, once I asked a very progressive colleague of mine, I said, what do you think about patriotic? And she said, I can't stand this stuff. I said, why not? Like, what happened? Was it always the case? And she said, no, in the 70s, 80s, we were not like this, but then it changed. So then I asked her a question. I said, well, what would make you patriotic again? She transformed. Really. She said, if it was about belonging, she would take this term seriously again. Right? So the reason what I'm trying to say is that we have this sort of virtue signaling, this deep culture, cancel culture, especially for folks who are not, a lot of the Afghans here who are not familiar with this. These terms, this language, makes a huge difference. And if you're just worried about, well, how do I fix Afghanistan? Or in my case, how do I have impact in strengthening democracy? If you're not careful with what terms you use, you're already canceled before you even know you're canceled.
You should have CGM use word from Paul.
yeah. So to show you an example, here is one example. I went to Interfaith America. It used to be called Interfaith Youth Corps. I worked with this organization. I helped them for like 10 years almost. One of our grantees, and they changed their name to Interfaith America because their mission had really scaled. And so I went to their launch event. Paul Miller, I had worked with Paul Miller. He's a Georgetown, professor at Georgetown University, and he's worked with the evangelicals very seriously. So I worked with him on a study to understand what the evangelicals have done. And it's called Faith and Healthy Democracy, if you want to see the report. Like just how the Southern Baptists really think about democracy. It's a great report. So I went to the event, and he gave me his book, and it says we need to build, right? And then Paul Miller gives me his book, and it says, how do you save, America from Christian nationalism, literally the religion of American greatness. So it's very interesting because it's not like Paul is trying to engage the liberals. No, he's actually telling his own conservative folks, how do you save America from Christian nationalism? But it's interesting, Ibu, who has very good credentials on the left, right? Like he's been a social activist all his life. He's built this huge institution. He was, a fellow with Obama's White House. Is all of a sudden now feeling like I need to tell the progressives to be a bit more reasonable. So that's what he's saying, right? Like being an arsonist against the current. So he's basically saying is you have to build, be an architect of a more promising future than being an arsonist against the current system. Right? Why is he doing that? Because he's even feeling like he now can use the word build. Right? I mean, this is just an example. For me, when I looked at the two books, I was like, what are prompting these two amazing leaders trying about these issues? And they're not even engaging their other side. They're trying to actually also even tell their own sides to take this seriously. So this brings me to the kind of really aha moment. I think we are in a new phase of one of the, American, we refer to this as an experiment, the American experiment, right? I think this could be one of America's, biggest moment. We have a great, amazing opportunity ahead of us. America is for the first time becoming a multiracial, multicultural democracy. It wasn't before. It's happening. I mentioned 2045, it would become a majority minority country. Only if we get it right, this can happen. And that means a few things. One is, this is not the first time this happened. Okay? When in the early 1900s, when the Jewish folks and the Christian and Catholic folks came to this country, they experienced a lot of discrimination and hardship in this country. So there was this project, they call it the National Coalition of Christians and Jews. They literally invented this term Judeo-Christian. It's not, I mean, if you're a student of theology like me, like you understand, I don't know how much Christian there is in Judeo, okay? But they did, and it did an amazing job of really integrating the Jewish folks and Catholic folks to this country. So you have to transition from that to what it means to be a multicultural and multiracial country. Because the Judeo-Christian did its job, and now there are millions of Muslims, millions of Hindus, millions of Sikhs, many Buddhists, that are coming to this country. And what does it mean now to move from a Judeo-Christian nation to a more, multicultural, multiracial democracy? So I think the bridging movement that I would talk about could serve the purpose of what the National Coalition of Christians and Jews did back in the early 1900s. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is, Evil proposes that America should become a potluck nation. Right? So what he's saying is, like, think of it as a potluck, where if everybody brought a salad, it would be a very boring potluck, right? So he is basically proposing that everybody bring your own dish, and what makes a potluck a success, a beautiful story, is if everybody brought their dish in their own unique ways. I'm proposing slightly something different, right? For those of folks who are comfortable with a melting pot, they can stay there, right? And for those of us who are a little different, right, we can stay with a potluck. But what that means is that you have to build a muscle that just doesn't exist in the US today, which is, how do you deal with differences, right? And not just the differences that you like, but also the differences that you don't like. We don't have that muscle. So I've been to every corner of this country. I've worked with the progressive, highly progressive, and I've also worked with the Southern Baptists, okay? Everybody today feels like they're the victim, okay? And everyone feels like they're being offended and they're being constantly under attack, right? So you just don't have that muscle for how do you hold nuance and complexity? How do you hold differences, right? So we have to build that muscle. One of the people that came to my mind that does this brilliantly is actually Imam Majid and Bob Roberts. So Bob Roberts has a mega, he's an evangelical, he has a mega church at the heart of Texas, you know, and Imam Majid is a Muslim Imam. He is in DC, is Dallas Mosque. Both very traditional. I think both are trying to convert each other. I think Imam Majid is trying very hard to convert Bob Roberts. Okay. and Bob Roberts trying to convert Imam Majid. They're working very hard on that. But despite that, I mean, Bob Roberts literally tells Imam Majid that at the end of the day, I still don't think you're going to heaven, right? He jokes with Imam Majid, like that's what he told him. But I love you and I have the deepest admiration for you. That's the kind of difference, right? Like you're not selling your core identity, you're not selling your heritage. In fact, in my work, I've worked with Buddhists, I've worked with Hindus, I've worked with Christians, I've even met the Pope. It's only deepened my own faith and my own heritage. It doesn't change you. It actually gives you a new appreciation for who you are and what your heritage is. It actually does the opposite thing. You know, when you're trying to engage with other folks, it just gives you a deeper meaning. So what I mean by differences is that it doesn't necessarily mean you sell out who you are. I mean, if you're comfortable with melting pot, that's great. But if you are more like a potluck kind of person, you have to build that capacity where people can be different from you, and yet, despite that difference, you see their sacred dignity, you see who they are, and you can build this capacity like Bob Roberts and Imam Majid has done. They've done it brilliantly. Bob Roberts has even been to Afghanistan to do this work, and he's an evangelical, like he's a very serious evangelical from the heart of Texas. So now this work that I talk about, the ecosystem that I talk about, that I was part of, is really scaled. It's grown, like this, I mentioned the BMAC, the Bridging Movement Alignment Council. Only this group has 300 plus organizations in this coalition. The new pluralists that I talk about 3 years ago, when we started this conversation, nobody even wanted to be part of it. Today, it has already raised like more than $40 million. I think it's on its way to get $100 million. And the goal is to raise $1 billion for this field. So everybody, the small organization, Venture Angels, that I'm working in community transformation, started 4 or 5 years ago. Now they have at least 11,000 due-paying members across the US. So there's a lot of interest in this work. People are trying to bridge the divides and do this right. Now, earlier I showed you the problem of what needs to happen. You really have to break through this toxic feedback loop, right? Which really can, it's like at the core of why we have the toxicity in our culture. These folks, what they're trying to do is they're using this social contract theory, like of seeing and knowing the other, to get into solidarity, right? A foundation. And the new pathways. I think a lot of this work is about innovation. If you're talking about the new birth of democracy, this multicultural, multiracial democracy, we have to change our ways of how we've been working. And like you need new solutions. So there is this beautiful ecosystem that's emerging that I just showed you earlier, this one. And they're using this kind of model. And what they're trying to do is, once somebody asked me, they said, why would Reverend William Barber, he has this amazing social justice campaign called the Poor People's Campaign. Why would he take this work of preaching, of strengthening democracy, of pluralism seriously? Like he has his thing about social justice. And I said, well, there is no social justice without democracy. This democracy is gone, right? How are you going to fight for? So the same thing applies. If you care about, in today's context, if you care about the environment, if you care about social justice, no matter which rights you're after, if you don't take care of this horizontal issue, which is this toxicity, which is really the backsliding of democracy, if you don't deal with that, no matter what your cause is, you're not going to be successful, right? Because even at the interpersonal level, what polarization does to you, and this is what I talk to people about, like George Floyd, if they tell you, I can't breathe, you don't hear them. because your animosity is, elevated to such levels that you don't even see like things that are in front of you that should be obvious to see. You just don't see it, right? So that's why for a lot of these folks that we're working with, what we're trying to say is that whatever your vertical cause might be, whether it's you're in an education setting, you have to be a node in that ecosystem, trying to build that connective tissue, and then vertically advance your work. So that's happening. And my hope was, when I was doing that, that this would turn into some kind of movement. Right? So this is what I was working on, is when I worked with Braver Angels, where there's an organization called Bridge USA. They work on college campuses. So when I worked with all of them, you do? Okay. So Manu is here. I worked with Manu very closely. And is that one of them alone, so when they asked me what success looks like, I said, you 10 of you, right? StoryCorps, Braver Angels, One America, even if you grow 50-fold, you're not going to resolve this problem. What you need is an ecosystem. What you need is a movement to address this problem because it's so big. So to me, when you ask me what success looks like, it was to channel the energy of a whole ecosystem in that problem. And that's why this, for example, was very important to me, right? I was like, if you're alone doing this thing, and if you don't have a coalition, horizontally, you're not going to be able to do anything. You're not going to even put a dent in this. So that's what I was hoping, is that this would somehow turn into a movement, and then that would reverse that toxic feedback loop and break through to the exhausted majority. Now, here's the question: will it succeed? I'm not as optimistic right now as I used to be, and here is why. So, what we know in the US, there's a report I would urge everybody to really look at. It's called the Hidden Tribes, okay, by Morgan Coleman. What you find in the Hidden Tribes report is that there's a clear exhausted majority in the US. Okay, it's all these people from here to here. These folks feel like they have no agency, and no matter what they do, it doesn't mean anything. Right? So basically, for the most part, they have given up. All the noise, everything rests here and here, right? In the two wings. They suck up all the oxygen and they take all the noise. It's split to maybe 6%, 8% on two sides, right? Now, one of the things I kind of learned is as we try, this whole ecosystem, what it's trying to do is reactivate the exhausted majority. The whole ecosystem that I showed you, their audience is the exhausted majority. You're telling them you got to engage more civically. You can make a difference, right? To give them agency back. What I'm finding is that means you're actually taking some of that power from the wings. Right? And so more broadly, what I'm finding is that as you do that, the extremes of each side are becoming, like they're realizing that. And so what I see in the culture more broadly, about 5-6 years ago, the other side was evil, right? What I'm seeing now is you're evil if you're talking to the other side. Okay, so now they're coming after those folks who are doing the bridge building.
You don't do it on a campus.
Okay, so, and to me, what I'm realizing is because they feel like they're losing power. Because if you're shifting the power back to the exhausted majority, what happens is these wings then come after you, because they, as a result of that polarization, they're getting a lot from it, both sides. And indirectly, they're actually helping one another. I mean, they might not say it, but I'm saying, like, whether it's you're the far right or far left, you're indirectly benefiting from one another's polarization, right? And so the shift now, what I see is, on one hand, the work has really increased. Like every organization I've worked with in the bridge building space, they have 5-10-fold really scale with their work. So on one hand, the work has really scaled. On the other hand, when you look at the problem, it's worsened as well. And one of the reasons is this. So what I say is that something has to happen in the system. Politically, culturally, it might work, but politically, the Democrats and Republicans, they have to figure out a way to hold members of their own parties accountable if they're polarized, right? They have to figure out a way. If they don't do that, the second option is this bridging force has to turn into some kind of political force. If that doesn't happen, I don't think just on the cultural side, right? It's like somebody told me 3, 4, 5 years ago, they're like, so I was talking up to them about this work and they said, oh, it's like bringing a stick. It was a very progressive person. Like, it's like bringing a stick to a gunfight. Okay. And I was like, no, this cultural side really can make a difference. Now I'm not, because the way I see the intensity of that pull, of that polarization, where it literally shifted from, the whole, even the cancel culture, from, well, the other side is evil to now you're evil, you're talking to the other side, right? Like people are then all of a sudden very vulnerable. Like the base from which you're operating is abandoning you, and the other side doesn't trust you anyways. So what do you have? Right? You either have to create your own tribe, okay, because you lost the tribe you were in, and you're also not welcome by the other tribe. And so as a connective tissue, I feel like I'm not sure how effective they can be if one of these two big things don't happen. So that's one. The second, I think, risk that I see, well, there are a lot of tough issues, like any field building effort. A lot of these organizations, this is a nascent field. So everybody's like, oh, this is mine, this is mine. So they have to deal with the tough issues. Then, I am also a little bit worried about the whole bridge building space being appropriated by the left as another liberal project. This happened to civic education and civic engagement. Right? Is this big worry among a lot of bridge builders who cannot, by the way, anyways, a lot of conservative people don't trust this one. They're like, oh, this is just another liberal thing. You're just trying to diffuse us, right? But as you try to do this with all the different stakeholders, there is this big risk of it being hijacked again. And I've tried very hard, and many of the folks that are doing this work are trying very hard for this to be representative of all the different ideological diversity that is in this country. So that's a big issue. Now, I would say, for a lot of the people who want to engage in this work, there are many amazing organizations. Citizen run, Brave Angels is the best. Like I said, they have 11, anybody can join Brave Angels. If you are working with the faith community, One America movement, they're really amazing. They work with out there, especially on polarization. Bridge USA, Manu is a great friend. He's on a lot of campuses. So if you're on campus, I think you should definitely engage with Bridge USA. And then, so Interfaith America is also on campuses. I don't know if they're here or not, but they're also nationally very active. This is another friend of mine, Eric Liu. He has a Citizen University, and he's very optimistic. He's like, this is just the beginning of democracy in the US. It's not the end. So that's another way you can think of it. And finally, I will go to questions. This is what works, right? I think, this collective illusions, this perception gap is one of the biggest issue that I try to explore, which is that we know there is common ground. 87% of Americans are tired of this. They want to work together. 87%. Right? There's just this two extremes, right? 5 to 10% that is sucking all the oxygen of the whole thing. So we know there is common ground. There's a lot more unity than people think. But so correcting that works. And one of the studies we just concluded is Bridging Divides in Democracy with Stanford University. What we found is all of these are some of the most effective methodologies for doing it. I personally focused on the social contract theory, right? I said you have to have a way to bridge civic bridges as the kind of bottom-up approach. And the second thing I had focused on was this elite kind of prophetic voices, both faith and prophet. So it's basically leveraging quotes from political leaders. Unfortunately, it makes a huge difference, as much as you may want to discredit it, but at least political leaders, party leaders, prophetic voices, they make a huge difference in this effort. So was it optimistic or was it negative? I mean, I think one of the key questions for me, so in Afghanistan, let me put it this way. In Afghanistan, the last 20 years, what we tried to do was build negative peace. And we were like about 15–20% of negative peace, working towards positive peace. And then we lost it, it became zero. In the US, we are in about 80% of negative peace. The US is still not considered from a peace building framework, a positive peace country, by the way. So let's say if we are in that 80% of negative peace, working towards that beloved community of what you would call sustainable positive peace. One of the questions that I have is, do you think you should be in a more defensive posture right now, given the toxicity in our culture, given the backsliding of democracy? Should you be in a more defensive, just to hold the 80% gains? Or should you still be acting in the offensive posture, which is a more justice-oriented agenda, right? It's a question. A lot of folks that are focused on social justice ask this question. I'm like, don't you think you should be just holding to the 80% gains for a little while because the situation is pretty bad? Or should you just be operating in the offensive state and working towards that positive peace? So that's my question. I mean, now you all get to ask questions. Was it too much? Not that bad. But I don't know.
George.
So, I want to make sure everybody who's a proper member here has it.
No, you're good.
So I think the best way to approach the question, as you work with all these different groups, and identify them by inherited identities, if you will, you also work with people in other countries. So how strong do you perceive any difference in your side with the way Americans of a certain ethnic ethnicity hold that identity, as opposed to perhaps being born into that identity in a setting where that's the way it was? I'm ethnically lots of people who grew up in or born in the state of Korea. I was born and raised here, and my suspicion, I'm not involved, but my suspicion is that a lot of people who are born into some ethnic traditional identity here can hold it quite the same way as if they were born into it, as if everybody around lived by that, as if all reality is and I'll put it back to what I suspect that in this country, even if you don't hold it fully consciously, the fact that you are defined as an individual with rights, that means that you are choosing even if you don't want to choose it. I go to my father's evangelical church, and his brother and his father. I still have that inherent choice where perhaps if I was born in the dock, I would have to hang out with a certain kind of French cat, and that would be the way the group is without the same kind of choice of a certain odd person. Is that a fair observation in your experience? And I don't know if you've had a chance.
Yeah.
And is my premise fair that it might have something to do with
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that there are multiple narratives that play out into this, right? And it depends on who you're talking to, right? This narrative, someone once told me, she was like, well, the United States is a young country, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have its own unique history and identity and narrative. And one of the questions that they also ask is, what story or narrative do we tell, right? Because one version of it is America in the early days was a very religious country, right? There were a lot of traditional religious folks from Europe came to the US as part of the early settlements. And do you let that define America, right? Then if you look at the native folks, they have a very different narrative of that. If you ask the African-American experience of it, it's a very, they would talk about the origin of sin. So I mentioned the Judeo-Christian. I mean, this was literally an invention, right? It's been an evolving story, I think. And I think what makes this different now is this broader shift, and mostly the sort of majority minority context. I think that is new. That is very new. That's very different because you had one dominant group, and if that is shifting, it has really drastic consequences, I think, for how you share power, even, right? And so I think that conversation as a whole would shift quite drastically. And with it, right, so then now people are asking all, really foundational questions about the founding of the country and what are you willing to have a conversation about and what are you willing to not have a conversation about, right? So in terms of social cohesion, the US, I think, is ranked pretty poorly right now, right? Like, some of the lowest indicators for social cohesion. I think the US receives that, and it's precisely because of these big tensions. And some of them, like even I don't feel comfortable touching because they're so hard. It's like a landmine, a lot of, especially issues of racial reconciliation. They're very tough to even engage. Please.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you the presentation, we learned a lot. I think it was like a testament to like how you read it. Very clear, like what problems are. Even though it's a very broad issue. So whatever I say comes off as critique, it's not necessarily critique. It's just more or less me trying to get.
Please.
I think a very important issue that you're raising. So as someone born and raised in the United States, and as like someone who's just been like learning more about the history of the United States, I actually don't think there's ever been a point in time in which there has been consensus in the United States that since the founding, it has always been about two sides, or there has always been something within the United States that has been bubbling that always, in some sense, threatened. And that it's kind of a testament to our political institutions that it has made it this far and that there has been some like diplomacy. And going back to like when you started the presentation, you showed us that map of the midterm election. And I think one thing that a lot of commentators have talked about as that map that you showed us is kind of special right now because it reflects the way in which our electoral institutions are set up. The majority of the United States utilizes winner-take-all elections.
Yeah. And
so in talking about I like how you talked about kind of this ecosystem of ecosystems and then converting this energy of ecosystems into a movement.
Yeah. And
maybe thinking from culture, moving that to more politics, to thinking about a political movement. For me, a political movement that I would get behind, in which I believe would address polarization, would be electoral reform. Rather, and looking at the kinds of things you were talking about, to me, it was more about messaging, about how to talk to both sides and bridging the gap. And I totally agree. I'm all for that type of discourse, and I believe that's very important. Forceful society to have a way to let this stuff be very complicated issue. So I guess I have two questions. One, am I incorrect to maybe this is what it helps to have outside opinion in thinking about the country I grew up in as never really being on the same page? Is there, what do you say after you looking at American history that there actually is something unique about maybe there having been a point in which there was consensus? And then my second question is, do you think like my idea, or not my idea, sort of a proposal of electoral reform that it doesn't really fully address.
Yeah, I think two specific points. One is, like I said, this whole majority minority thing is really a game changer. Like, I really want to stress this is a new thing, right? You have one homogeneous group, and it's just like, and that's why I purposefully said, you know, diversity is a cherry on the top is one thing. When it has real consequences for power sharing, it's a whole different story, right? And so before, maybe sure you had differences, but it didn't have these kind of drastic consequences on the overall identity and shape of the nation. And so there are bigger questions of social cohesion and political violence, right? So we ran this whole project called the After Charlottesville project, after what happened in Charlottesville, right? So the backsliding is a real issue. That's why I said, you know, in one of my I said, you should be careful, because in Afghanistan, we were not as careful when they opened the Qatar office. Karzai built in 2003, okay, and then they raised their flag, and I don't know which 26 or some 2006. Karzai was really, we didn't really understood what it meant, but politically it was a really drastic thing in the Afghan context, right? Here, I'm telling you, January 6th is that moment, right? Don't take it slightly, because it was a really, really big moment, right? You take it lightly, but these are the trends, so that the potential for political violence in this, when you feel like you're losing it all, right? So that's the one thing. And the second thing, what I'm suggesting is that with polarization, given the toxicity of it, right, the level to which it's gotten, you're not going to be successful on any of these reforms. It's not going to happen. Right? I mean, I asked a lot of progressive folks. I'm like, the Senate is yours, the House is yours, the President is yours. How did you lose Roe and Wade? Right? I'm asking them a question. You are in power, right? You had all three branches. I mean, you didn't have the Supreme Court, but at least the executive and judicial in the House and Senate. How did that happen? It's just a question I have. And so no matter which issue, whether you're trying to bridge the divide between religious freedom and all these LGBTQ rights, right? Like, these are, to me, they're both cherished rights. They're not, you know, one shouldn't be at the expense of the other, right? If you really think about it. But if you're like, it's right now is nobody, there is no way to even bring these two sides together, let alone think about constructive solutions. So unless you bring that down, no matter which cause you're after. I mean, of course, this electoral reform is one of the biggest ones. So is immigration reform. So is, like, you know, fiscal reform, healthcare reform, all these. That's why I started with the social pathologies and all these social problems, because you cannot make progress on any of that unless you reverse the toxicity. Because tomorrow you propose this, and you say this is the best solution, and here is why it makes sense, and you're constructive, you could work 10 times harder than the person who's just shouting against you. That person will be much more effective than you are. Right? So unless you create that conditions for the goodwill, for the solidarity, that connective tissue, where people are actually, you know, they diffuse, put their guard a little bit low. Like, unless you do that, you're not going to be effective. So this is just, yes.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I have a question to play devil's advocate to the argument for finding common ground. So I think it would be really great that I think that the gold standard of democracy is finding somewhere in the middle. If you've got radicals on both sides, right? You've got Che Guevara on the left versus Mussolini on the right. That's dangerous on either side if you slide too far in either direction for the country. Question that I have is, what if you have a Mussolini on the right, but then you don't have a countering force on the left that's as radical? You have somebody more like Bill Clinton on the left who's going to compromise, you know, a lot more. Does that, or the opposite being true, you have somebody like maybe George Bush on the right, who's, you know, moderately conservative, but then you've got your Guevara on the left. Do you move the center point in one direction dangerously by finding common ground?
Yeah, I think my experience has been a little bit different. So I think the context is really important in all of this, right? So it's just like that saying, don't throw the baby with the bathwater, right? Like, so I think the worry for me is in today's context, the liberal response to even whether it's white nationalism or Christian nationalism shouldn't be a form of liberal fascism, right? And for me personally, I am as much disturbed by that form of liberal fascism than that I am about white or Christian nationalism. So if you give me these three options, that there's going to be a liberal fascism, there's going to be a white nationalism, there's going to be a Christian nationalism, most probably I'll pick Christian nationalism. And like if you're telling me like choose between the three worst scenarios, so I'm not sure that's not the case, right? Because what I see on the liberal side is your response shouldn't be cancel culture, right? Your response should be purity tests, right? And it's happening. That's why I brought the language issue, because depending on which circle you're in, right? Like I could, like if you're telling me, the two biggest issues are, white or Christian nationalism, then I know I'm dealing with this. But what do I do with this? Right? Like I don't know which liberal circle I'm in and which language you're going to pass. Like I'm here to like make some difference, and you're telling me you've already canceled me because I used a certain term or didn't use another term, or I put some title, but I didn't put some titles. Like, what do you do with that? Right. So I'm not sure, right? That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure it's just on one side. Like I think the problem is pretty severe on both sides, to be honest. Please.
A comment on the question. On the question of why the polarization is happening, I think it's not just mere diversity or isolation of people since COVID. Looking at data of Pew, one of the key trends which differentiates America from Europe is the trend of secularization of society in the United States. Europe went through that secularization much earlier, and the United States is going just a couple of years ago onwards. So it's something which is, understandable why society is polarized over values of liberal or conservative compared to the rest of the society. Like if you ask the question to what extent you would like United States to be a Christian nation, around 45% of the people will say yes, and that's not the case in most of the European countries. That's much lower, like 30% or something like that, depending on which.
Yeah.
So the fact is that mere diversity is not a problem. Diversity, even in other societies, in the United States, it's based on immigration, but in Asian countries like Afghanistan, India, inherently for a longer historical range, those countries were diverse, but it didn't lead to polarization in our countries. Of course, current context is different. Second, one term that I didn't see in your presentation is the term which is used in a new theory, intercultural dialogue. You talk about bridge building, but in context of Britain, Australia, some of the North African countries, one of the key solutions towards ghettoization of societies and polarization has been intercultural dialogue. I want to know if you know about that, and to what extent you differentiate between bridge building and intercultural dialogue.
That's true. Yeah.
Because in a intercultural dialogue, what is important, of course, dialogue is important. You bring people from different spheres of life to speak with each other. But there are certain conditions for it. You can't create dialogue out of blue, right? There should be open space, respect, dialogue. But also you need to address power parity.
Yeah.
You cannot bring people who are deprived historically and set on the same
Yeah.
table with people who doesn't have that kind of deprivation.
Yeah.
So how do you do? And
Yeah, I think this is a good question. So, America, the US particularly, has historically been a very religious country compared to the UK. I mean, to the Europe. Religious. Okay, so you have to acknowledge that it still is compared to Europe by, and there's historical, right? That's why I mentioned earlier that the first wave of immigrants were very religious people, particularly the Taliban of Europe came here. And so you have to understand that. And that's why I think Ibu is proposing an interfaith America, right? So he's saying it doesn't have to be religious, less religious necessarily. It's okay. That's why I said, if you wanna, I think this phrase of melting pot and potluck applies very well, and we have to figure out what it means to be both ends. Because I think there are going to be pockets of people that are going to continue to be religious. And there are going to be people that are just gonna melt in the melting pot, right? And that's fine. How do you hold these two differences? And so the biggest, I think, issue is not diversity, but ideological diversity, right? That's where in most places, especially in progressive places, they're okay. I mean, you can be Hindu, Jewish, whatever, they will marry you. But if you're conservative, you stand a chance, right? And so, I mean, I'm saying this is ideology, and it's not just, I'm not saying you should, I mean, that's maybe a good thing, not to marry, but it applies to everything, right? Like whether you treat people fairly, whether you understand that they're different. That's why I brought Imam Majid and Bob Roberts, because they know they're different. They're never going to be the same ideologically. Okay? But they have developed that way of appreciation for one another. And that's the kind of muscle I think this country needs to build. I mean, if all your responses is, I'm offended now and you're canceled, right? How many people are you going to cancel? Right? And especially if you're going to have more and more people that are going to have that kind of worldview, that kind of mindset. So and softening it, it's not a big deal. It's just different from you. And from treating it as like, oh, I'm offended, to he's just thinking differently. Really, it's a mental model shift in a way. And so if this thing is happening, otherwise, like Ibu says, and I really agree, this diversity in itself is a perfect recipe for more tribalism in America. You are not going to get less polarization. You're not going to get less tribalism if you do not figure out. And I'm telling you, this, the data suggests you have 90% of, the biggest group that does not even have a friend in their core friendship networks that is of color. So how is that, what does this diversity mean? You're segregating, right? So that's, and in terms of your second issue, I use the seeing here on purpose because it's a shortcut for me. Where you see the seeing here? The seeing, I put this here on purpose because there are hundreds of methodologies. There's a lot of innovation that people use for dialogue methodologies, for bridging. There are science of polarization to, intercultural conversation to braver angels between red and blue, they use marriage therapy. Okay, so the methodology that they use to bring a wife and husband to make peace, they use the same methodology to bring a red and blue together and have a conversation. They use marriage counseling. So there's a lot of innovation. Some of these organizations are really doing amazing work. Some are basically going to mosques and churches and tell them, okay, you understand the theology, you understand the preaching, but let me teach you what happens in your brain. What is the science of polarization? Like, why does your brain get polarized? So there are a lot of interesting methodologies for how they do it. And that's why I mentioned Professor John Powell, because he's the best. He's like, bridging work is helpful, but you cannot be structurally blind. Like you have, like your point, you have to consider the structural element of it. Not everybody comes to the bridging work from the same point of view. And I actually went one step further in my work. There are groups that are not ready for bridging. Okay. And what you have to do is, I call this intra-group conversation. You actually have to switch back and say, why don't you all do your intra work of getting ready for bridging work? Because the intergroup is the second step. There are many groups, like for example, a lot of African Americans are not ready for bridging. When you go to them, they will tell you, oh, you have told us to be silent for 400 years. You have told us to be nice for 400 years. You're just peppering over our grievances. We're done being nice. So what do you tell them? Right? That's their response. So you have to invest time in them trying to get ready for pluralism and bridging work, because a lot of groups, usually LGBTQ, that's their response as well. They don't want to be in this work. They're like, we just want to be fighting. So how do you do that intra-group work? Sometimes it's not even ideal. Many groups are not ready. Yeah.
Lots of thoughts, but thank you for this.
Please.
Okay. So on this issue of polarization in the United States, when you see this toxic split breakdown on ethnicity, as I can just mention, historically in the United States, the groups that were considered white have changed over time. So Italians, Irish, Jews, you can see these kinds of split evolve over time. That these groups were not, now they're considered white, but 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago, they were not.
Yeah.
So you could, if you want to think about this historically, have we seen these cycles before? Is this really anything new? And to this, my colleague Timothy Lavano and Ilya Murtazashvili, we wrote a paper called America's Institutional Exceptionalism in the Trump Presidency. And we argue that American institutions, political institutions, so to your point, are actually very well equipped to handle populism and these kinds of episodes of polarization that are not new to this country. And that we had a civil war, a devastating civil war. But yet we've had these bouts of populism historically. I think what makes them quite frightening is this, right? And how identity has now shifted. We look at like Yasha Monk, you're familiar with his work, how identity is no longer on ethnic or racial grounds in the United States, but a lot of public opinion shows that our ethnic group is our Asian. And so when you meet people, it's like they'll send you signals as to like what group they belong to. I find this all the time. And I just think it's really, really unhealthy, really strange that people have to send you those signals to know, for you to know whether you're in their tribe or not. So that's a big statement and a question. So this is this new? Is this toxicity really so different from what we've seen before? I know that you're not a historian.
I know. I hear your point. I think you're right. I mean, Jonathan Haidt wrote recently a great piece on the Atlantic, How Social Media Made Americans Stupid. Literally, that's the title. Yeah. So social media is a big driver of this, but I think I've been in enough conservative circles to tell you that I'm concerned. Right. There's a lot of frustration, and again, I think there are different reasons for it. I think one of the thing, I mean, like this economic hardship, like let's not underestimate this piece, right? Like I think I was talking to someone and I said, oh, we the middle class. And she reminded me, she's like, oh, you and me are not anymore the middle class. We're in the top 90%. I was like, I'm barely surviving. Like, how am I in the top 90, like top 10%, right? So like, like the rest of the 90, like given the shifts that are happening, I think people are really feeling the pain of that, right? And so there is not necessarily one particular issue, right? And now on top of that, you have social media, all these drivers, right? And then one of the key other issue is this perception gap. Like it feels so real, right? Like what I see is that people are actually really, I mean, their guards are really up, right? That's the biggest piece. Like the biggest piece is what we do and how we behave. Because in a lot of circles, what I see is we further intensify it. We further validate it, right? And in many circles, people are getting canceled left and right, right? And so, I don't know. I mean, for me, I think it's different.
I have a hypothesis. I want to know your thoughts.
Sure.
So I don't know. Do you know Yuval Levin?
Yeah.
Okay. The time to build, right?
Yeah.
And so he makes this point that like American institutions used to be formative, and that people have their character built on institutions. You came out of universities or newspapers, and you were molded by institutions, and you grew as a result. And now people don't use these institutions as formative; they use them as performative, right? Mm-hmm. So they perform on them. They get social media accounts. They care about in the institution. They just got their Twitter and they want to show who they are, and they can burn the institution down. Mm. And so he argues what time to build. We have to focus on building institutions very much the way that tells us, right? But I think the danger that I see is that there is a sense that you identify between the conservatives and the builders and the progressives as the tear down. But I worry that where I see a lot of people on the right, even if they're conservative, they don't feel that they have any institution outside of those that are the church, because the secular institutions no longer belong. They no longer feel that they have space. So even if you want to build and participate in a university or a newspaper or these broader cultural institutions, that your perspectives are no longer welcome there. And I think that leads to a very certain kind of alienation, that you're a builder and that's your instinct, but you're not welcome to build.
Yeah. So it's also, I mean, this is the thing, right? Like Ibu is, I wouldn't say he's a conservative, right?
No,
right? So here's the thing, like Ibu is now branded as conservative. Mm-hmm. Right? So here, the thing, like how you understand conservative shift. What is progressive? Like, so in the progressive circles that I've been to, the shift I've seen is 4 or 5 years ago, nobody would ever even think pluralism is a conservative term. Never, ever. Now, there are progressive circles right now where even the term pluralism is conservative. Interfaith is conservative, right? So the shift that you see has gotten so big where now you have to be in the two parts. Like, what about the people like the Igbos, the Imam, right? So a lot of them, they're saying we're politically homeless, right? And so it's very hard to say what is what now.
But I think what we're seeing is though, if on the left they're saying burn it down, the progressive side, right? Dismantle. And historically it was on the right where you'd say, I'm not saying Patel, but historically it was the right conservatives that preserve, right? Preserve, build. And now what I'm seeing on that side of the right is that they feel like there's no space to build anymore. And so they're turning into the same dynamic we see on the progressive side, burn it down, burn it down, burn it down. And that dynamic, rather than creating like any kind of cycle, you're seeing burn it down on both sides of the spectrum. And that, I think, is what's leading to a very unhealthy dynamic, is that nobody then believes in any institution. Everybody wants to burn it down because nobody feels like the institutions mean anything to them.
It's connected to this, let's say on social media, Twitter is level. Conservatives
Not anymore.
things that is predominantly dominated by level. And then conservatives created alternative social media platforms like Parliament. The fact is that why that's not in faction and why they don't have that potential to replace, for example, the social media like Twitter.
Yeah,
The fact is that there is something wrong with their conversation or the core beliefs that they cannot touch more people on their side.
Well, I think poverty was started by a very
yeah. So here, I mean, I think even with that, right? So Elon Musk, the whole reason Elon Musk was saying we should have Twitter is so that there could be free speech, right? And that now, I don't know why you understand that as a conservative thing. Like if you want to open democracy, right? Like you really believe in a free open society, you should be happy about a open platform, right? No, on progressive side, you're canceled. Right? Without, I mean, Elon Musk has not done anything yet, but many progressive folks have canceled Twitter already, right? So I have done work, right? Like I've done work on online safety and, hate crime and hate speech. We had a whole project from after Charlottesville. We studied all of these things with all tech companies, with public policy officials. I worked with ADO, on how it should be monitored. There's a difference between hate speech and free speech, right? Like not everything is hate speech, right? But in the progressive side, anything you disagree with is an offensive speech. You're offended by it, right? So that's why, like, I keep repeating this phrase, like, you have to learn how to be okay with differences. Like, not everything that, like, you shouldn't be canceling everything that you don't agree with. Right? I mean, because then you're really creating alternative universe. Like, how many Twitters are you going to cancel? If this issue was not as bad as it's gotten, there would be no need for Elon Musk to buy Twitter to begin with. You see? So I think, I mean, this just points to the whole technology, this polarization, and it's almost everywhere. In every place. Is at least policy and academic and higher education is like, which I think Jen you were referring to is I mean, the toughest of it all. I mean, it's really hard if somebody is conservative to be in higher ed. There's no it's not often higher ed is not a conservative friendly place. We've spent many years exploring this question: how do you make higher education, friendly to conservative ideology? It's not. Please.
Yeah, I really like this topic. I've been thinking a lot about these particular issues just from the context of my own work. And I just wanted to make a point that, one thing to think about is also how our institutions or social norms regarding how we communicate with each other, have those changed over time. And I think like there's like just a general kind of decline in the value of objective communication and objective information transmission.
Yeah.
Everyone feels like they need to state an opinion at all times and have an opinion that corresponds to a particular group. So we don't really know how to react to objective information in a way that I think we once used to know how to do. We kind of try to see all information as falling into one category or the other. So like I have some work which talk about this from like a game theoretic perspective. It's I don't know, it's just interesting. I've been thinking a lot about these kind of issues about polarization, how it relates to the way people transmit information.
Yeah, I would love I would look to Einhorn. This is one of the funders. David Einhorn is a big, philanthropist. He has a thing called Einhorn Collaborative. And they their biggest focus is on isolation, right? Like people just have lost all the, all the capacity to engage. And I think, just how much time we spend on devices just general isolation. And, you know, the Taco Well, you know, I mean, I put this here. I think in the beginning, I put it there. So, Democracy in America. It's a really famous book, you know, Taco talks about this. And when he came, you know, I think from Europe to the US about 100 or so years ago, he looked at democracy and said, why is it working here in a way that's not working in Europe? And he left and said, basically, it's the local civic participation in the local civic institutions, right? So your churches, you're really local. That's gone. Like, much of it's not there. You know, I mean, we talk about your Jewish community, maybe that's, you know, but more generally, it's not like church attendance is like, you have no idea how much it's declined, you know, like some of these institutions are really in bad shapes. So I think that really is one of the central pieces of this, right?
We have 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left.
Some of these groups are really good. I mean, I would really look into One America, I mean, or Brave Angels. Some of these really.
Faculty advisor for Bridge, what's called Bridge.
Bridge USA?
Yeah, I'm the
Okay.
faculty, so there's an undergraduate group that has Bridge USA chapter here.
Okay.
And we've organized some events in the past, not this year, but we've done this.
Yeah, some of these are really, I mean, some of the reason I am interested, I think these groups are interesting because they're doing some of the most interesting cutting edge, new age thinking. Like, look at New Pluralists. It's they have like 50 different organizations. This one in the center, this is the biggest initiative we had. New Pluralists, they have like field builders.
You were very instrumental in creating this.
Yeah, I was very much part of it. And it's a big one. They have like 50 field builders, like some national organizations. And each of those organizations look into that because the work they're doing is cutting edge. It's like different. It's, you know, like how do you shift the paradigm to a new way of thinking? And I think that's what's interesting about them is like really looking for new ways and new methodologies and new questions. Some are, you know, like I worked with in the system space, I worked with MEF, like the Millennium Action Project here, and they're working with the young lawmakers under 40, both at the state and federal level. And I worked on leadership development for them. So it's very different. They have both conservative and progressive lawmakers that are, you know, the next generation of leaders. And they're working with them on, you know, how do you champion bipartisan policy making, but also leadership development. How do you build inner work resiliency and all these? So I think some of this really has amazing potential, despite me being not optimistic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.